Every offseason, at least for the last 10 years or so, you have media outlets publishing their NBA player rankings from ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Bleacher Report, CBS, and so on. And every year, as fans, we eat it up, whether it be raging about how awful their rankings are or praising them for finally giving their specific guy his due and putting him higher than where he maybe should be. And it's funny because we should know by now that these are the ultimate clickbait publications to see where they stacked up players on their respective teams, but it works because we all want to see the list. And it's funny because no matter how they structure their list, inevitably they're going to get some that are way off, especially when they're ranking 100 plus players in the NBA. And so as fans, content creators, we always feel the need to call out where they got things wrong. And so in today's video, I'm going to be focusing on two outlets that put their top 100 lists in the NBA for this upcoming season and discussing where they put players from the Chicago Bulls and how right or wrong they were. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. I should note that the two outlets who posted their top 100 rankings that I'll be covering in this video are ESPN and CBS Sports, as I found their rankings the most egregious of the bunch. Now, back in the day, and I know this because I've been following the NBA player rankings for a while, but back in the day, they used to cover the entire active NBA roster and rank them one by one. I believe it was 400 to 450 players, some of which weren't even on fully guaranteed contracts, some were on two-way deals. Then they slowly started reducing that amount that they ranked players. In the last few years, they've only done the top 100. So I am curious where some of the guys who were not ranked, where they would actually fall in the top 100 list, or I guess I should say the top 400 list, but we'll save that for another day. But where I wanted to start was with the Bulls and where they rank players closer to 100 and then go down from there. Well, first, let me actually say all the players from the Bulls roster that were included in the top 100, regardless of ranking, whether that be both or just one of the lists from ESPN or CBS, and that was Zach Lavine, DeMar DeRozan, Nikola Vucevic, Lonzo Ball, and Alex Caruso, which isn't too much of a surprise, except maybe Alex Caruso, although maybe not since he's the GOAT, which, by the way, I can't tell you how many people take comments like Alex Caruso being called the GOAT seriously. The most watched video I have on this channel is about Alex Caruso and why people call him the GOAT, and I've had so many people coming at me in the comments saying I'm a casual because I think that Alex Caruso is actually the greatest player of all time. Like, no one in their right mind actually thinks Alex Caruso is the greatest basketball player of all time. It's clearly a joke, and it says more about the people who think anyone is serious when calling him the GOAT. But I digress. Let's talk about these rankings, and we'll start with Nikola Vucevic, who actually ranked 90th, yes, 90th on CBS and 57th on ESPN. Talk about a drastic difference between the two outlets ranking Vooch. Now, ESPN's ranking of 57th, I'm not too fussed about because it's probably around where Vooch should be among all NBA players, but we'll talk about that in more detail. But for CBS Sports, to rank Nikola Vucevic 90th in the entire league is absolutely absurd. Almost to the point where it was like they started putting together the list starting from number 1 and going up from there and realizing they got to 90 and forgot about Vucevic and just threw him in there. Because when you hear some of the players that they ranked ahead of Vooch, you'll wonder if these guys even watch basketball. Now, because I'm sure you were all curious, or at least I was curious anyway, how do they even determine these rankings, especially when you see a player that is so far off where they should be? How did they arrive at such conclusion? Well, according to CBS, they have gone with the consensus approach where they had each of their NBA writers come up with their top 100 list, taking into account potential improvement and decline. Then, through a quote-unquote not-so-complex process, you're telling me, we arrived at one glorious list to rule them all. That's it. Potential improvement and decline, and consolidating all of their lists together with no explanation of the formula for how they got there. Great. Here are some of the guys that actually they ranked ahead of Vucevic. Nicholas Batum, Herb Jones, Seth Curry, Lou Dort, Brooke Lopez, Harrison Barnes, Gordon freaking Hayward, a dude who can't stay healthy and is a shell of himself. You talk about decline, they put him at 79, 11 spots ahead of Vucevic. Alex Caruso, which we'll get to, they put him at 77. I love AC, I love his game so much because he's such a hustler on the defensive end, but come on now, he's not a better overall player than Vucevic is. Tyler Hero, Aaron Gordon, Kyle Lowry, Al Horford, these are just to name a few. Look, I've talked about this before. I know Vucevic had a down season. Let's not sugarcoat it. Vooch underperformed last year relative to his expectations. Expectations meaning the all-star that the Bulls traded for, who was putting up near 25-12 with the Magic. Again, we knew that wasn't going to happen when Vooch came to Chicago. His role was obviously going to change. He was no longer going to be the number 1 option. Once we added DeMar, he was then no longer going to be the number 2 option. And yes, Vuce could have been used better. The Bulls could have gone to Vuce more and let him operate in the paint. They could have used him more as a playmaker in the post, as Vuce is actually a very underrated passer for a big man. But yes, even with all of that, Vucevic had a bad season. He's going to be 32 soon. So if you are basing it off of potential improvement and decline, then yeah, Vuce is no longer a top 50 player in the league, whereas last season he was, no question. But 90th? And of all those players I mentioned, you're putting them ahead of Vucevic? The dude still averaged 18 and 11, also averaging 3.2 assists per game, along with a steal and a block per game. Yeah, he didn't shoot the ball well. Wasn't that efficient relative to what we're used to seeing. Still, an 18.2 player efficiency rating, which is decent. Like, come on now, guys like Batum, Gordon Hayward, Seth Curry, Harrison Barnes should not be ahead of Vucevic when you actually compare them side by side based on what they were able to do this past season, and then also just looking at their future potential. Now, you look at his ESPN rating, like I said, that's probably more accurate and a fair comparison to have Vucevic at 57. The prior year, I believe he was actually at 39. Significant drop, but like I said, it makes sense based on the kind of season Vucevic has had and also just given his age and the possibility of a further decline. And all the guys they had ahead of him, I really can't disagree with. And by the way, none of the players I called out earlier that CBS had ahead of Vuce were ahead of him on ESPN. Now, let's move on to the next guy who was only featured in one of these lists, and that was Alex Caruso, which I mentioned. CBS ranked him as 77th, while ESPN didn't have him cracking the top 100. And man, AC at 77, that's a stretch. I wouldn't be opposed to it if you put him in the, say, 90 to 100 range, because he actually impacts a team's success so much so when he's on the court. But putting him that high, ahead of guys like Vuce for one, Clint Capella, DeAndre Hunter, Kyle Kuzma, Grant Williams, I don't know that you can put AC ahead of those guys. I'll take it because I love Alex Caruso and I think he's one of the more underrated players in the league, but 77 is a stretch for him. Let's move on to Lonzo Ball, who was ranked in the top 100 for both publications, and I'm curious how much these rankings would change after the news we got on Lonzo missing at least the start of the regular season, making his future in the league a bit more uncertain. But for Lonzo, he was ranked 61 on CBS and 78 on ESPN. It's hard to rank Lonzo now after what we recently learned, because a lot of these rankings are based on the potential for this upcoming season, and Lonzo's season as a whole is in question. But assuming the surgery goes well, assuming he miraculously comes back at the earlier part of the timeline, so only misses a week or two of the start of the season and a handful of games, yeah, I like these rankings for Lonzo. I'd probably put him somewhere in the 65 to 70 range. Really, for Lonzo, when he's healthy, is a very underrated player. He's developed into being one of the best three-point shooters in the league, one of the most efficient with volume on threes that he's taken. He's an excellent floor general, especially in transition, and the Bulls, without a doubt, were a much better team when he's on the court. I don't consider Lonzo a star-level player, not yet anyway, but a very impactful role player that the Bulls absolutely need to be a strong team in the East. 61? It's a little high, especially when you look at the fact that CBS had guys like Tobias Harris, John Collins behind Lonzo, also Vucevic. Not sure I would put those guys ahead of Lonzo, especially with his injury concerns, but it's not terrible of a ranking. For ESPN, putting him at 78, no, even with Lonzo's injury history, he's better than that. When you compare him to players around him throughout the league, they had guys like Dylan Brooks, Harrison Barnes, Al Horford, Spencer Dinwiddie, Russell Westbrook ahead of Lonzo. Yes, I would not put Westbrook ahead of Lonzo at this stage in his career. They also had younger guys who I think haven't really proven much of anything. Guys like RJ Barrett, Jalen Green, those guys should not be ahead of Lonzo Ball. For all of this, you have to look at what a player brings to the team's success and how well the team performs when they are on the court versus when they are off of it. And that's where Lonzo really stands out. Yes, with Lonzo, it's a challenge because if you're factoring in the potential for this season, it's a bit questionable. But overall, Lonzo is a better player than most of these guys. And until we see him actually showing signs of reduced skill and performance because of his injuries, we can't just assume that he's not going to be the same player we saw before he got injured. Now, for DeMar DeRozan and Zach Lavine, I think this is where things get the most controversial. DeMar and Zach are far and away the Bulls' best two players. They were both All-Stars this past season, and DeMar finished the season being selected All-NBA second team, and yet somehow neither of these guys cracked the top 25 on either list. How is it that a second team All-NBA player isn't considered a top 25 player in the league? And don't give me, well, he's 33, how do we know that he's still going to be doing the same thing going into next season and that he's not going to decline? DeMar DeRozan was ranked 28th on ESPN and 33rd on CBS. I'll get to Zach Lavine, but I wanted to start with DeMar because I think that is straight garbage for a player who was selected second team All-NBA, averaged 28 points per game on 50% shooting and 5 and 5 in rebounds and assists, was one of the top 15 most efficient players in the NBA. Dude had one of the best seasons of his career, and he was in the MVP conversation for most of the season, and you're ranking him 33rd best player in the league? Only 15 players are able to be selected to an All-NBA team, and only 24 players are able to be selected as All-Stars. DeMar met both of those, and yet CBS is here putting guys like Anthony Edwards, Kyrie Irving, Bradley Beal, Rudy Gobert, Bam Adebayo, Brandon Ingram, Drew Holiday, Pascal Siakam, Chris Middleton, Donovan Mitchell, Zion Williamson, who hasn't played a game in over a year, Anthony Davis, who was always getting injured. Anyway, you get the point. There are a lot of players that I feel should not be ranked ahead of DeMar DeRozan, not when he had the season that we just saw, and especially for a lot of these players who didn't even come close to being All-NBA players or even NBA All-Stars, and especially when DeMar was the only constant and consistent player on the Bulls last season that generated a lot of wins. Now, for Zach Lavine, I was a little more okay with these rankings. Zach was 27th on ESPN, one spot ahead of DeMar, and on CBS he finished 26th. I still think Zach deserves to be in the top 25. He's shown he's one of the more elite scorers in the league, one of the better outside shooters in the NBA, and he's doing more and more when it comes to impacting the game with his improved playmaking and rebounding, and although his defense is still pretty mediocre, he has improved his defense over the last couple of years compared to when he entered the league and was strictly just an offensive player. Before the Bulls added DeMar, Zach was the Bulls' go-to number one option and finished just shy of the 50-40-90 club. Like, when people talk about efficiency, Zach is one of the more underrated players that isn't talked about enough for how efficient he is on offense. Now, I will say, as great as Zach is, DeMar should be ranked ahead of him, but I also get the fact that if we're looking at potential for this upcoming season and whether a player will decline, yeah, Zach is going to have the edge over DeMar given his age. But anyway, that's one aspect of these rankings that I take issue with, is having Zach ahead of DeMar on both of these lists. But if we're looking at Zach Lavine and saying he's a top 25 player, I'm sure some will ask, well, who would you put Zach ahead of if you think that he does crack the top 25? Well, I personally think Zach is a better player than Donovan Mitchell. Mitchell is slightly younger, but when you look at the players side by side and see what Zach is able to do from an efficiency perspective, he's ahead of Donovan Mitchell. Both lists have James Harden ahead of Zach Lavine, which, yes, I know James Harden is a superstar level player, but the last couple of seasons, he hasn't shown that he's the same James Harden. And I don't know how you can consider him to be a better player than Zach Lavine, especially at Harden's age and as he continues to show signs of decline. Two other guys I mentioned as far as players that they put ahead of DeMar as well, both Zion Williamson and Anthony Davis. Yes, both players who are incredible when they're healthy, but they haven't been able to stay healthy. We didn't see Zion play at all last year. Anthony Davis hasn't been able to stay healthy throughout his career, is about to turn 30 years old. And on CBS, they had both Zion and Anthony Davis at 17 and 16 respectively. How can you possibly put those players that high as the best basketball players in the game, especially with what other players have been able to accomplish? Zach Lavine has earned his spot to be considered a top 25 player of all time and has only continued to get better and better, while some of these other guys ahead of him have started showing signs of decline. There are a lot of other things about these rankings that I take issue with, even just outside of Bulls players. I mean, ESPN had both Devin Booker and John Morant in the top 10, which I think is way too high for those guys. Both great star players, but they are not top 10 players in the NBA. I can see Ja getting there one day if he can stay healthy, but he's not there yet, not number 9. They also had Kevin Durant at number 8, which I don't even like Kevin Durant, but he's absolutely higher than number 8. He's arguably a top 3 player in the league. I don't know how you can put him that far down. They have Bradley Beal at 19, and yet somehow DeMar and Zach don't crack the top 25, which is just ridiculous. Anyway, all in all, this is why I hate these top 100 lists, because there are so many different factors and variables to consider when assessing where a player ranks among the greats of the NBA, and oftentimes it just ends up becoming a personal preference. And it's virtually impossible to put 100 players all assigned to a different ranking, when in reality, NBA players really should be ranked in the tiers. There are a lot of players who are pretty equal or on par to a number of given players in the league in a specific tier. So it's why I take issue with these top 100 lists, because more often than not, there are always going to be so many players who are going to be ending up falling well below where they're worth, or they're way too high for where they rightfully should be. But regardless, we always end up wanting to see where they stack players up against each other. But I want to know what you guys thought of some of these rankings and where they rank the guys on the Bulls roster. Let me know in the comments. And as always, guys, be sure to subscribe as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.